The streets of Washington, D.C. were filled with the sounds of celebration on the evening of Good Friday in 1865. It had been 5 days since news of General Robert E. Lee's surrender had been announced to the city, and each night since had turned the nation's capital into a scene that was essentially a huge, unbroken street party. The streets filled up with crowds cheering, drinking, and celebrating the coming end of the war which had ripped the United States apart. During these nights, one of the favorite activities of celebratory citizens was to join together for a tradition called a serenade. During a serenade, a group would walk through the city and visit hotels, theaters, public houses, or government buildings, surround the government official who was the intended target of that night's serenade, and sing patriotic songs as a public show of gratitude for the work of saving the Union. One of these serenades was what brought dozens of proud citizens to the steps of Ford's Theater the night of April 15th. Inside, they knew that their beloved President Abraham Lincoln was attending a show of the play Our American Cousin. The crowd was eagerly waiting for Lincoln to step out from the show so that they could give him his own surprise serenade right there on 10th Street. But of course, it was not the president who first exited Ford's Theater that night, but instead a wave of terrified men and women who still did not understand what had just happened inside. The scene had already turned to chaos inside the theater even before the shocked patrons had made it out to spread word of the shooting. But now, as word spread to the gathered crowd that Lincoln had been shot, the whole situation became a tinderbox. There were calls in the crowd to burn the theater to the ground, with some people convinced the man who shot the president must still be hiding in the wings. Others in the crowd stormed inside and began pulling out staff who worked in the theater, accusing whoever they grabbed of being the assassin. Some in the crowd even wanted to march to Capitol Hill, where Confederate prisoners of war were being held in order to take revenge. In the midst of this chaos, though, the very man that the crowds were seeking was trying to find his way out of this tinderbox that was Washington. John Wilkes Booth, the man who had just shot and killed the president inside Ford's Theater, was desperately trying to make his escape. Now, after his deadly shot was fired inside the president's box in Ford's Theater, Booth's primary goal had been achieved in taking his revenge on Abraham Lincoln. However, his full plan for the assassination had been much more ambitious, and the rest of the plot had failed spectacularly. The other two men who had been targeted for the assassination that night were Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, and both had almost miraculously emerged from the bloody evening alive. Because of the survival of Seward and Johnson, the ultimate goal of Booth's plot, which had been to bring down the entire Union, had failed. And this would be played out over the coming weeks, but despite the shocking blow of President Lincoln's death, the United States government still stood strong. There would not be a collapse of the Union government or sudden shift in the tide of the war for the Confederacy. But as Booth fled from the scene of his own successful assassination, he had no way of knowing that the other parts of his plan had failed. His only concern in that moment was avoiding the men and women who were desperately trying to get their hands on the man who had just shot the president. And Booth's flight from the scene of his bloody crime almost ended before it even began. Joseph Stewart, an Army major and lawyer who was at the play that night, had been one of the first people to react to the shooting. He had nearly grabbed Booth before the assassin made it out of the theater, but Stewart had slipped when trying to cross the orchestra pit to get to Booth. After exiting into the alley behind Ford's Theater, Booth managed to mount his waiting horse despite the fresh break in his lower leg. Just as he climbed onto his horse, Stewart burst out the back door behind him. Struggling to control the animal amid the pain of his injury, Booth had teetered on top of the horse for a moment, nearly crashing to the ground. This gave Stewart an opportunity, and he grabbed at the reins. But Booth regained control just in time, spun the horse away from the lawyer. Stewart lunged at Booth one final time, but Booth spurred the horse, took off down the alleyway into the night. And after getting away from Stewart, Booth made his way down side streets and out of the city. The next challenge in his escape came in crossing the border into Maryland. Shortly before 11 p.m., Booth reached the Navy Yard Bridge, which runs over the Anacostia River, separates Washington, D.C. from Maryland. Now, this bridge was guarded by a soldier named Sergeant Silas Cobb, who was part of a tiny detachment of Massachusetts men assigned to keep watch over the bridge and surrounding woods. As Booth approached Cobb on the bridge, he had no way of knowing if word of the assassination had already reached the soldier. Cobb halted and questioned Booth, telling him the law did not permit passing across the bridge before 9 p.m. And Cobb asked Booth why he was trying to attempt a crossing so late. Booth responded that he was riding home to Charles County and had left on purpose so that he could have moonlight to see by. Remember, this is 1865. Technology was obviously far different than it is today, and Booth had managed to stay ahead of the news of the assassination. The soldier accepted this answer. Cobb let the assassin cross the quarter-mile-long bridge on foot, walking his horse. Now, although Booth managed to talk his way around Cobb, who was the one man who stood between the assassin and the freedom of open country, he did make two crucial mistakes in his conversation with the soldier. First, Booth gave his actual name to the man. Second, he told him his destination was Beantown, which was in the true direction Booth was headed. The manhunt for the killer would kick off in earnest. These would become crucial pieces of information used to track him down. And once firmly on the Maryland side, Booth looked around for his co-conspirators who were supposed to meet him beyond the bridge. With no one in sight, he mounted his horse and rode onwards into the night. For the moment, at least, it seemed like he had escaped justice for his terrible crime. Back in the city, Booth's other conspirators in the plot felt the net tightening around them as the news of the killing began to spread. Only one of the other three assassins made it out of Washington to join Booth, and that was a man named David Harold. After watching his other companion, Lewis Powell, attempt and fail to assassinate the Secretary of State, William Seward, David Harold left Washington and followed the same route as Booth, eventually reaching Sergeant Cobb on the Navy Yard Bridge. Cobb stopped Harold and questioned him just like he had done with Booth. Harold came up with his own excuse for traveling after the 9 p.m. curfew, telling Cobb he had been meeting a female friend on Capitol Hill who had kept him late. Cobb must have had sympathy for this story, and he let Harold pass just like he had with Booth. Just before midnight, Harold reached a place called Soper's Hill that had been chosen as the rendezvous point for the gang. As he rode up the hill, he caught sight of Booth waiting in the shadows. Booth greeted Harold with excitement as soon as he recognized him. If he could only choose one of the men to make it out of the city, Booth would have likely picked Harold, as he knew the roads and forests of the area better than anyone. The two men probably spent a bit of time catching each other up on the bloody events of the night, with Harold learning for the first time that Booth had actually succeeded in killing Lincoln. Then they headed off into open country towards their intended safe house near Surrattsville. And if you just look at that moment, everything was looking as if it had gone almost perfectly for Booth. He killed the president, escaped the city, and now reunited with the guide who could lead him to safety. Booth must have begun to believe that he might actually make it out of the whole bloody episode as a free man, but he had no idea of the fury that was building back in Washington, or the determination with which the whole country would soon be searching for him. Now, Booth and Harold, the pair ended their first night on the run at the house of Samuel Mudd, a doctor with connections to John Surratt. The two rested in Mudd's house for about 12 hours. Booth received treatment for his injured leg, and Mudd gave them shelter and food. A major historical debate has arisen over how much Dr. Mudd knew about Booth and his assassination when he took the killer into his house. It seems like through his connection to Surratt that Mudd probably had some knowledge of the kidnapping plot, but there are plenty of questions about whether he knew that Booth had planned to kill the president that night, or if Mudd learned the news while Booth was under his roof, but continued to shelter the killer anyways. Regardless of his complicity, Mudd provided Booth with his last truly safe place of escape and rest. All around the area, the manhunt for Booth and Harold had already begun. In places as far off as Delaware and Pennsylvania, detectives, soldiers, civilians were being rallied to search for the president's killers. And even if Booth didn't realize it yet, the net was already tightening around him. With each hour that would pass, the determined search would draw closer to the two fugitives, leaving them finally with no place to hide.